My name is Michelle, and I'm 30 years old. I spent the last 15 years of my life serving our country in the military, far away from home and the people I loved. I always believed that when I returned, my husband would be waiting for me with open arms, ready to start our life together again. I met David when I was just 18 years old, fresh out of high school and full of dreams. He was 21 then, working at his father's small auto repair shop in our quiet town of Maplewood Heights. David had the most beautiful smile and could make me laugh even on my worst days. We fell in love quickly, the kind of love that felt like it would last forever. 2 years later, we got married in a small ceremony at the local church. My father, Robert, walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes. He was a simple man who worked hard his whole life, and he loved David like his own son. My mother had passed away when I was 12, so it was just me and my father for many years. He always told me that David was a good man who would take care of me. After our wedding, life was perfect for a while. David and I lived in a tiny apartment above the bakery on Main Street. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. I worked at the local diner during the day, and David continued working at the repair shop. We would spend our evenings watching old movies and planning our future together. Then everything changed when I turned 23. I had always felt a calling to serve my country, and despite David's protests, I decided to join the military. It was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made, but I knew it was something I needed to do. David didn't understand at first, but eventually he said he would support me and wait for me to come home. The day I left for basic training was the hardest day of my life. David drove me to the bus station, and we both cried as we said goodbye. He promised to write me letters every week and to visit whenever he could. I promised to come home to him as soon as my service was over. During my first year in the military, David kept his promise. He wrote me beautiful letters telling me about his days at the shop, about the people in town, and about how much he missed me. He would send me pictures of himself and little gifts that reminded me of home. I would read his letters over and over again, especially during the difficult times when I felt homesick and alone. But as the years went by, something started to change. David's letters became shorter and less frequent. When I would call him, he seemed distant and distracted. He would tell me he was busy with work or tired from long days at the shop. I tried to understand, knowing that maintaining a long-distance relationship was difficult for both of us. By my 5th year of service, David barely contacted me at all. When I would manage to reach him on the phone, our conversations were awkward and strained. He would ask me when I was coming home, but not in the loving way he used to. Instead, it felt like he was asking when his burden would be lifted. During my 7th year away, my father became very sick. David was the one who called to tell me the news. I requested emergency leave to come home and see my father, but by the time I arrived, he had already passed away. I was devastated that I couldn't say goodbye to the man who had raised me and loved me unconditionally. The funeral was small and sad. David stood beside me during the service, but he felt like a stranger. He didn't hold my hand or offer me comfort the way a husband should. After the funeral, I had to return to my duties, leaving David to handle my father's affairs. David told me that my father had left me his house and a small amount of money in the bank. He said the house needed a lot of work and that the medical bills had eaten up most of my father's savings. I trusted David completely, so I didn't question the details. I was too heartbroken about losing my father to think about money or inheritance. For the remaining years of my service, David and I grew further apart. Our phone calls became arguments about money and about when I would finally come home. David complained that he was struggling financially and that maintaining my father's old house was expensive. He would ask me to send him money for my military pay, which I did without question because I loved him and wanted to help. As my 15th year of service came to an end, I was excited to finally return home to David. I had dreams of us reconnecting, maybe starting a family and building a life together in my father's house. I had saved up a good amount of money for my military pay, and I thought we could use it to fix up the house and start fresh. The day I returned to Maplewood Heights was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I took a taxi from the airport, my heart beating fast with excitement as we drove through the familiar streets of my hometown. Everything looked mostly the same, though some of the old shops had closed and new ones had opened in their place. When the taxi pulled up to my father's house, I was shocked by what I saw. The house looked completely different from how I remembered it. The yard was perfectly maintained, with beautiful flowers and a new fence. The house itself had been renovated and looked like it belonged in a magazine. There was a brand new car in the driveway, something David could never have afforded on his repair shop salary. I paid the taxi driver and walked slowly toward the front door, confused and curious about how David had managed to afford such expensive improvements. I rang the doorbell, too nervous to use my old key after being away for so long. When David opened the door, I barely recognized him. He had gained weight and was wearing expensive clothes that I had never seen before. His reaction to seeing me was not what I had expected. Instead of joy or excitement, he looked annoyed and almost angry. "Michelle," he said flatly, not even moving to hug me. "You're back." "Yes, I'm home," I said, trying to smile despite his cold reaction. "Aren't you happy to see me?" David stepped aside to let me into the house, but his body language was stiff and unwelcoming. As I looked around the inside of the house, I was even more confused. Everything was new and expensive. The furniture, the decorations, even the floors had been completely redone. "David, how did you afford all this?" I asked, setting down my bags in the hallway. "I've been working hard," he said shortly. "Business has been good." Before I could ask more questions, I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. To my complete shock, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was younger than me, probably in her mid-20s, with long blonde hair and a pretty face. She was wearing a silk robe and had clearly been comfortable in my father's house. "Oh," she said when she saw me, her face turning red. "You must be Michelle." I stared at her, then at David, unable to process what was happening. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is Amanda," David said, not even having the decency to look ashamed. "She's been helping me take care of the house while you were away." The way Amanda looked at David, the way she stood so comfortably in my father's house, and the expensive renovations suddenly made terrible sense. My husband had been living with another woman in my father's house, spending money that should have been mine. "Helping you take care of the house?" I repeated, my voice getting stronger as anger began to replace shock. "It looks like she's been doing a lot more than that." David's face hardened. "Look, Michelle, things change. 15 years is a long time. I'm not the same person I was when you left, and neither are you." "So you replaced me?" I asked, tears starting to form in my eyes. "You replaced me and spent my inheritance on your new life." "Your inheritance?" David laughed bitterly. "What inheritance? Your father was broke, Michelle. He left behind a rundown house and a pile of medical bills. Everything you see here I worked for. I built this life." I knew he was lying. My father had always been careful with money, and he had worked every day of his life until he got sick. There had to be more than what David was telling me. "I want to see the will," I said firmly. "I want to see my father's will and all the paperwork." "Fine," David said, his voice full of contempt. "But you're not going to like what you find. Your father left you nothing but problems, Michelle. Nothing but problems." As he walked toward his office to get the papers, Amanda placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that was clearly meant to comfort him. The sight of another woman touching my husband in my father's house was more than I could bear. That's when I realized that the man I had loved for 15 years, the man I had remained faithful to while serving my country, had not just replaced me. He had stolen from me, lied to me, and was now trying to make me feel like I was the problem. But David had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that his lies were about to catch up with him in the most devastating way possible. The next morning, I woke up on the couch in what used to be my father's living room, now transformed into David's luxury home. Amanda had spent the night in what used to be my bedroom with my husband, while I slept alone downstairs like a stranger in my own inheritance. David came down the stairs dressed in an expensive suit, clearly getting ready for work. He looked at me with disgust, as if I were some kind of burden that had been dropped on his doorstep. "I've been thinking about this all night," he said, tossing a stack of papers on the coffee table in front of me. "I think it's time we made this official." I looked at the papers and felt my heart stop. They were divorce papers, already filled out and ready for my signature. "You want a divorce?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Michelle, be realistic," David said, his voice cold and cruel. "We haven't been married for years. We've just been two people with the same last name. You've been gone for 15 years and I've moved on. Amanda and I want to start a family together." "But I just got home," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I just got home from serving our country. Don't I deserve a chance to try to make this work?" David laughed, a sound that was full of contempt and cruelty. "Serve our country? You abandoned me, Michelle. You left me here alone for 15 years while you went off to play soldier. And now you come back expecting everything to be the same? Expecting me to drop my new life for you?" "I was serving in the military," I said, my voice getting stronger. "I was protecting people like you. I was doing my duty." "Your duty?" David's voice was getting louder now. "Your duty was to your husband. Your duty was to stay here and build a life with me. But you chose the military over me, and now you have to live with the consequences." Amanda appeared at the top of the stairs, listening to our conversation. She looked down at me with a mixture of pity and satisfaction, as if she had won some kind of competition. "Just sign the papers, Michelle," David continued. "Sign them and move on with your life. You're poor. You have nothing, and you have no place here anymore. I'm giving you a chance to leave with some dignity." "Poor?" I said, standing up from the couch. "You think I'm poor?" "I know you're poor," David said with a cruel smile. "Look at you. You have nothing but the clothes on your back and whatever small amount of money you saved from your military pay. You can't even afford a place to live. You're sleeping on my couch like a homeless person." His words stung because they seemed true. I had no idea about my real inheritance, no idea about what my father had actually left me. David had controlled all the information for years, and I had trusted him completely. "Sign the papers," he said again, more forcefully this time. "Sign them and get out of my house." "This is my father's house," I said weakly. "This is my house," David shouted. "I paid for every renovation, every piece of furniture, every improvement. Your father left you nothing but debt and problems. I'm the one who made this place worth something." I looked at the divorce papers through my tears, feeling completely defeated. Maybe David was right. Maybe I was poor and had nothing. Maybe I had sacrificed everything for my military service and had nothing to show for it. But then I thought about my father, about the kind of man he was and the way he had always taken care of me. Something didn't feel right about David's story. My father had always been responsible with money, and he had worked his entire life. There had to be more to the story than what David was telling me. "I'll sign the papers," I said finally, "but I want to do it properly. I want to go through a lawyer and make sure everything is legal." David's face lit up with satisfaction. "Fine. We'll go to court tomorrow and get this over with. But don't expect to get anything from me, Michelle. You're leaving with exactly what you came with. Nothing." As I prepared to face the legal end of my marriage, I had no idea that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything. David thought he had one, but he had no idea about the storm that was coming. The next morning, we met at the courthouse for what I thought would be a simple divorce proceeding. David arrived with Amanda, both of them dressed in expensive clothes and looking confident and happy. I arrived alone, wearing my old military uniform because it was the nicest thing I owned. David looked at me with disgust and whispered something to Amanda that made her laugh. I felt humiliated and small, exactly the way David wanted me to feel. But as we sat in the courtroom waiting for the judge, I noticed something strange. There was an older man in a suit sitting in the back of the courtroom, and he kept looking at me with a kind expression. When our eyes met, he nodded slightly and smiled. Then the judge called our case, and everything in my life was about to change forever. Case number 2024 to 1847, Peterson versus Peterson. The judge announced in a deep, authoritative voice, "Dissolution of marriage." Judge Harrison was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at both David and me with the practiced expression of someone who had seen hundreds of divorce cases over the years. "Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Peterson, please approach the bench," he said. David walked confidently to the front of the courtroom, his expensive shoes clicking on the polished floor. I followed behind him, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Amanda stayed, seated in the gallery, watching with a satisfied smile on her face. "I understand this is an uncontested divorce," Judge Harrison said, looking at the papers in front of him. "Mrs. Peterson, you've been served with these papers, and you're agreeing to the terms." I looked at David, who was nodding encouragingly, as if he was trying to help me get through a difficult task. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. "And Mr. Peterson, you're requesting this divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences?" "Yes, Your Honor," David said confidently. "My wife abandoned me for 15 years to play soldier. We've grown apart, and I've moved on with my life. She has nothing to offer this marriage anymore." The judge looked at David with a slightly disapproving expression. "Mr. Peterson, I'd appreciate it if you would show more respect for your wife's military service. Mrs. Peterson, thank you for your service to our country." I felt a small spark of warmth at the judge's words, but David just rolled his eyes impatiently. "Now, before I can approve this divorce, I need to address the matter of property division," Judge Harrison continued. "Mr. Peterson, you've listed the family home at 245 Maple Street as your sole property. Can you explain this?" "Yes, Your Honor," David said smoothly. "The house belonged to my wife's father, but when he died he left behind nothing but debt and medical bills. I've spent the last 8 years renovating and improving the property with my own money. My wife contributed nothing to these improvements." "Mrs. Peterson, do you agree with this assessment?" the judge asked me. I wanted to disagree, but I didn't have any evidence to contradict David's claims. "I don't know, Your Honor. I was deployed overseas and trusted my husband to handle my father's affairs." "I see," the judge said, making notes. "And do you have a copy of your father's will?" "My husband has it," I said, glancing at David. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. "Here it is, Your Honor. As you can see, Robert Mitchell left his daughter the house and approximately $3,000 in savings. The medical bills from his final illness totaled over $15,000. The judge took the folder and began reading through it carefully. As he read, his eyebrows slowly rose higher and higher. He looked up at David with a puzzled expression. "Mr. Peterson, this appears to be a very abbreviated version of Mr. Mitchell's will. Are you certain this is the complete document?" "Yes, Your Honor," David said, but I noticed a slight tremor in his voice. "That's everything the lawyers gave me." "That's interesting," the judge said slowly, "because according to my records, Robert Mitchell's complete will was filed with this court 8 years ago, and it's quite different from what you've presented." My heart started beating faster. David's confident expression was beginning to crack. "Your Honor, I don't understand," David said. "This is what I was given." "Mrs. Peterson," the judge said, turning to me, "were you present when your father's will was read?" "No, Your Honor," I said. "I was overseas. My husband handled everything." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Peterson, I'm going to need you to explain why you failed to provide your wife with the complete will, because what I have here paints a very different picture of Mr. Mitchell's estate. David was starting to sweat now. Your Honor, I'm sure there's been some mistake. Maybe the lawyers made an error. The lawyers made an error? The judge's voice was becoming stern. Mr. Peterson, are you suggesting that the legal firm of Wellington, Brooks and Associates made an error when they filed this will with the court? I had never heard of Wellington, Brooks and Associates, but they sounded like an expensive law firm. My father had always used a small local lawyer for his simple legal needs. Mrs. Peterson, the judge said, turning back to me, I think you should know what your father actually left you. David's face was now pale white. Your Honor, I object to this. We're here for a divorce, not a will reading. Mr. Peterson, the judge said sharply, when property division is involved in a divorce, the court has every right to examine the true ownership of that property. And what I'm seeing here suggests that you may have committed fraud. The word fraud hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Amanda, who had been sitting smugly in the gallery, suddenly looked worried. Your Honor, please, David said desperately. This is a simple divorce case. My wife just wants out of the marriage, so she can move on with her life. Is that true, Mrs. Peterson? The judge asked me. Do you just want to finalize this divorce without understanding your full legal rights? I looked at David, who was staring at me with pleading eyes. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered how he had treated me, how he had called me poor and worthless, how he had mocked my military service. No, Your Honor, I said firmly. I want to know what my father left me. Judge Harrison nodded approvingly. Very well. Mrs. Peterson, your father, Robert Mitchell, was apparently a very intelligent man who planned carefully for your future. He opened a thick folder that had been sitting on his desk. According to the complete will filed with this court, your father left you much more than a house and $3,000. David looked like he might be sick. Your father owned significant mineral rights to land in the Blackstone Valley area, the judge continued. These rights have been generating substantial royalty payments for the past 8 years. Royalty payments. I whispered. Yes, Mrs. Peterson. Oil and gas royalties that have been deposited into a trust account in your name. The current balance of this account is approximately $2.8 million. The courtroom was completely silent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. David was staring at the judge with his mouth open. But that's not all, Judge Harrison continued. Your father also owned a portfolio of stocks and bonds that he had been carefully building for decades. The current value of these investments is approximately $1.9 million. That's impossible, David said weakly. Robert was a simple working man. He didn't have that kind of money. Mr. Peterson, the judge said sternly, your father-in-law was indeed a working man, but he was also a very wise investor. He lived modestly and invested carefully for his daughter's future. I was still trying to process what I was hearing. My father had left me nearly $5 million, and David had hidden it from me for 8 years. Your Honor, I said, my voice shaking, where has this money been all these years? The royalty payments have been automatically deposited into a trust account, the judge explained. However, the quarterly statements have been mailed to your home address. Mr. Peterson, as Mrs. Peterson's husband, would have received all of these statements. David was now visibly shaking. Your Honor, I can explain. I was protecting Michelle from the stress of managing money while she was deployed. I thought it would be better to handle these matters myself. By hiding nearly $5 million from your wife? The judge asked incredulously. Your Honor, I was planning to tell her when she returned, David said desperately. Mr. Peterson, the judge said coldly, you've been receiving quarterly statements showing deposits of hundreds of thousands of dollars for 8 years. Are you telling me you forgot to mention this to your wife? The pieces were starting to fall into place. The expensive renovations, the new car, the luxury furniture, David's expensive clothes. He had been stealing from me for years. "David," I said, my voice growing stronger, "you've been spending my money. That's how you paid for everything." "Michelle, please," David said, turning to me with tears in his eyes. "I can explain everything. I was going to tell you. I was going to share everything with you." "Share everything with me?" I said, my voice rising. "It's my money. My father left it to me." "But we're married," David said weakly. "What's yours is mine." "Not anymore," I said firmly. "You wanted a divorce, remember? You called me poor. You mocked me. You told me I had nothing." Judge Harrison was watching this exchange with great interest. "Mrs. Peterson, given these revelations, do you still wish to proceed with this divorce?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said without hesitation. "But I want to make sure I get what's rightfully mine." "Mr. Peterson," the judge said, "I'm going to need you to provide a full accounting of how you've spent Mrs. Peterson's inheritance money. And I'm appointing a forensic accountant to examine your finances." David looked like he was about to faint. "Your Honor, surely this isn't necessary. We can work this out between ourselves. Mr. Peterson, you've hidden nearly $5 million from your wife for 8 years. This case is now going to require a full investigation." Amanda, who had been silent in the gallery, suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, I had no idea about any of this. David told me he had earned the money through his business." "Ma'am, please sit down," the judge said firmly. "You're not a party to this case." But Amanda's outburst had revealed something important. Even David's girlfriend hadn't known about the stolen money. "David," I said, turning to face him fully, "you stole from me. You spent my inheritance on your girlfriend and your new life while I was serving my country." "Michelle, please," David begged. "I never meant for it to happen this way. I was going to tell you everything when you came home." "You were going to tell me?" I said, my voice full of disbelief. "Yesterday, you called me poor and worthless. You told me to sign the divorce papers and get out of your house. You said I had nothing." David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had been caught completely, and he knew it. "Your Honor," I said, turning back to the judge, "I want to proceed with this divorce, but I want to make sure I get every penny of what belongs to me." "Mrs. Peterson, you have every right to recover your inheritance," Judge Harrison said. "Mr. Peterson, you're going to need to get yourself a criminal defense attorney." "Criminal?" David said, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Peterson, hiding assets during a marriage, especially assets of this magnitude, is a serious crime. You could be facing charges of fraud, theft, and financial abuse." As the judge continued talking about investigations and asset recovery, I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me. For the first time in days, I felt like I had some control over my situation. David had thought he was so clever, stealing my money and building a new life while I was away. He had thought I was poor and powerless, but now the truth was coming out, and he was about to learn that his actions had consequences. But even as I felt vindicated, I knew this was just the beginning. David had spent 8 years stealing from me, and I had no idea how much of my money was left or what he had done with it all. As we left the courtroom that day, David tried one last time to approach me. "Michelle, please. We need to talk about this privately. We can work something out." But I walked right past him without saying a word. I had spent 15 years being loyal to a man who had betrayed me in the worst possible way. Now it was time for him to face the consequences of his actions. The next few days would bring even more shocking revelations about what David had been doing with my money, and I was determined to get every penny back. What I didn't know was that David had been even more devious than I had imagined, and the full extent of his betrayal was about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. 3 days after the shocking court hearing, I was staying at a small hotel in downtown Maplewood Heights while the forensic accountant began investigating David's finances. I had contacted a lawyer named Patricia Williams, who specialized in financial fraud cases, and she was helping me understand my legal options. "Michelle," Patricia said as we sat in her office reviewing documents, "what your husband did to you is one of the most severe cases of financial abuse I've seen in my 20-year career. He didn't just hide money from you. He systematically stole your entire inheritance." I was still having trouble believing the numbers. "So you're saying he took almost $5 million from me?" "That's what he inherited on your behalf," Patricia explained. "But here's where it gets worse. The forensic accountant found that David has been receiving those quarterly royalty payments for 8 years. Each payment was between $75,000 and $125,000, depending on oil and gas production. I did the math quickly in my head. That's almost $800,000 per year. Exactly. Over 8 years, David received approximately $6.4 million in royalty payments alone. Plus, your father's original investment portfolio has grown significantly. So how much money should I have right now?" Patricia looked at me with a serious expression. "Based on the forensic accountant's preliminary findings, your total inheritance should be worth approximately $8.2 million today." The number was so large I couldn't even process it. $8.2 million? Yes, but here's the problem, Michelle. David has spent most of it. My heart sank. How much is left? The accountant is still working on the final numbers, but it appears that David has less than $400,000 in accessible assets. The house, the car, his business equipment, it's all heavily mortgaged. I felt sick. So, he spent over $7 million in 8 years. I'm afraid so. And here's where it gets even worse. The accountant found evidence that David has been making large cash withdrawals and transferring money to offshore accounts. Offshore accounts. I had heard about these in movies, but I never imagined they would be part of my real life. David has been hiding money in banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. We're working with international investigators to track down these accounts, but it's going to be a long and expensive process. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of David's betrayal. So, not only did he steal my money, but he hid it where I might never be able to get it back. "We're going to fight for every penny," Patricia said firmly. "But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that we may not be able to recover everything." That afternoon, I decided to drive past my father's house to see if David was there. I wanted to confront him about the offshore accounts and demand that he return my money immediately. As I pulled up to the house, I saw David's car in the driveway, along with 2 other vehicles I didn't recognize. Through the front window, I could see people moving around inside. It looked like David was having some kind of meeting. I decided to wait and see who these people were. After about an hour, 3 men in expensive suits came out of the house. They were carrying briefcases and looked like they were discussing business. David walked them to their cars, shaking hands and smiling like he was closing some kind of deal. After the men left, I got out of my car and walked to the front door. I rang the doorbell, and David answered looking nervous and agitated. "Michelle, what are you doing here?" he asked, not inviting me inside. "I want to talk to you about my money," I said firmly. "I know about the offshore accounts." David's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me anymore, David. I have lawyers and accountants working on this. They know about the money you've been hiding." David looked around nervously, as if he was worried someone might be listening. "Michelle, you don't understand. It's complicated." "What's complicated about stealing $8 million from your wife?" "Keep your voice down," David said, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. "Look, some of that money is tied up in investments. I can't just give it back to you right away." "What kind of investments?" David hesitated for a long moment. "Business investments, real estate, things that will pay off in the long run." "I don't believe you. I think you've been gambling with my money or doing something illegal." "I haven't been gambling," David said defensively, "but some of the investments were risky." What kind of risky investments require offshore bank accounts? I asked. David's nervous behavior was making me more suspicious. Who were those men who just left here? Nobody important. Just some business associates. What kind of business associates? Michelle, please. Just trust me. I'm working on getting your money back. But you need to give me time. Trust you? I said incredulously. You've been lying to me for 8 years. You stole my inheritance and spent it on your girlfriend. Why would I trust you now? Because I'm your husband, David said weakly. Not for much longer, I replied. The divorce papers are going to be finalized soon, and then you're going to be in prison. Prison? David looked genuinely scared now. David, you committed fraud. You stole millions of dollars. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? I was going to tell you everything, David said desperately. I was going to share the money with you. You were going to share MY money with me. I said, my voice rising again. David, it was never your money to begin with. But we're married, David said, grabbing my arm. What's yours is mine. I pulled my arm away from him. Don't touch me, and don't ever use our marriage as an excuse for what you did. You betrayed me in the worst possible way. As I walked back to my car, David called after me. Michelle, wait. There's something else you need to know. I turned around, wondering what other horrible revelation he was about to share. The money, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Some of it is gone forever. What do you mean gone forever? I invested it with some people who weren't legitimate businessmen. My blood ran cold. What kind of people? People who promised high returns but then disappeared with the money. You gave my inheritance to criminals. I didn't know they were criminals at the time, David said defensively. They seemed like legitimate investors. How much money did you give to these criminals? David looked like he was about to cry. About $3 million. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. $3 million of MY money is gone because you gave it to criminals. I'm trying to get it back, David said desperately. That's who those men were today. They're investigators who are trying to track down the people who took the money. Private investigators cost money too, I said. Are you paying them with more of my money? David didn't answer, which was answer enough. You're incredible, I said. Even now, even after everything has been exposed, you're still spending my money. Michelle, please. I'm doing everything I can to fix this. The only thing you can do to fix this is to give me back every penny you haven't already lost or stolen. I will, David said. I promise I will. But as I drove away from the house, I knew that David's promises were worthless. He had been lying to me for 8 years, and he was probably lying to me now. The next morning, I got a call from Patricia that changed everything. Michelle, you need to come to my office immediately, she said, her voice urgent. The forensic accountant found something that's going to shock you. When I arrived at Patricia's office, she had a stack of papers spread across her desk. Michelle, sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear. I sat down, preparing myself for more bad news about my stolen money. The forensic accountant discovered that David has been running a Ponzi scheme, Patricia said. A Ponzi scheme? I had heard the term, but didn't fully understand what it meant. David has been taking money from investors and using it to pay returns to earlier investors. It's a form of fraud where you constantly need new money to keep the scheme running. So David was stealing from other people too? Yes, and he was using your inheritance money as the foundation for the scheme. I felt sick. How many people did he steal from? We've identified at least 40 investors who gave David a total of approximately $2.8 million. So not only did he steal my money, but he used it to steal from other people? That's exactly what happened. And Michelle, there's more. The FBI is now involved in this case. The FBI... I could barely process what I was hearing. Financial fraud of this magnitude is a federal crime. David is going to be arrested, probably within the next few days. I sat in stunned silence, trying to understand how my life had become so complicated. 3 weeks ago, I had been a soldier returning home to my husband. Now I was the victim of a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. What does this mean for getting my money back? I asked. Patricia's expression was grim. It means the situation is much more complicated than we initially thought. When the FBI seizes David's assets, they'll use them to pay back all the victims of his fraud scheme. You'll be one of many people trying to recover money from a man who has very little left. But it's my money, I said. He stole it from me first. I know, Michelle, and we're going to argue that your inheritance should be returned to you before any other debts are paid. But it's going to be a long legal battle. As I left Patricia's office that day, I realized that David's betrayal was even worse than I had imagined. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had turned my father's legacy into the foundation for a criminal enterprise that had hurt dozens of innocent people. But I was determined to fight for what was rightfully mine. David had underestimated me when he called me poor and worthless. He had no idea how strong I had become during my 15 years of military service. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens. When I looked out my hotel window, I could see police cars and FBI vehicles racing toward the direction of my father's house. David's day of reckoning had finally arrived, and I was about to witness the most dramatic collapse of his house of lies yet. I quickly got dressed and drove toward my father's house, following the sound of the sirens. As I turned onto Maple Street, I saw a scene that looked like something from a television crime show. There were at least 6 FBI vehicles, 3 police cars, and what looked like a news van parked outside the house. FBI agents in dark suits were walking in and out of the house, carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment. I parked across the street and watched as they systematically dismantled David's life of lies. Then I saw David himself being let out of the house in handcuffs. He was wearing the same expensive suit he had worn to court, but now it looked wrinkled and his hair was messy. Amanda was crying hysterically as she followed behind him, also in handcuffs. David Peterson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, and operating an illegal investment scheme, I heard one of the FBI agents say as they put him into a black SUV. As the vehicle drove away, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the man I had loved for 15 years, the man I had remained faithful to while serving my country. Seeing him arrested was both heartbreaking and deeply satisfying. One of the FBI agents noticed me sitting in my car and walked over to my window. "Ma'am, are you Michelle Peterson?" he asked, showing me his badge. "Yes, I am." "I'm Agent Rodriguez. We've been looking for you. We need to ask you some questions about your husband's activities." "I'll answer any questions you have," I said. "But I want you to know that I had no idea what he was doing. I was deployed overseas for 15 years. We understand that, Mrs. Peterson. In fact, you're considered a victim in this case, not a suspect." Agent Rodriguez explained that they had been investigating David for several months after receiving complaints from investors who hadn't received their promised returns. The investigation had uncovered the Ponzi scheme and revealed that David had been using my inheritance as the foundation for his criminal enterprise. "Mrs. Peterson, we need you to come to our field office to give a formal statement," Agent Rodriguez said. "We also need to inform you about what we found in your husband's house." An hour later, I was sitting in a sterile FBI conference room, answering questions about my marriage and my father's inheritance. Agent Rodriguez and his partner, Agent Chin, were professional but kind, understanding that I was also a victim of David's crimes. "Mrs. Peterson, we found evidence that your husband has been systematically stealing from you for 8 years, Agent Chin explained. "But we also found something else that might interest you." She opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "We found a hidden safe in your house that contained some very interesting items." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of items?" First, we found the original copy of your father's complete will, along with all the correspondence from the law firm that was handling his estate. I thought David had given me the complete will, I said. What he gave you was a fabricated document. He had created a fake version that showed only the house and a small amount of money. The real will shows the full extent of your inheritance. Agent Rodriguez pulled out another document. We also found bank statements showing that your husband had been forging your signature on various financial documents for years. Forging my signature? Yes, he's been signing your name on investment agreements, loan documents, and even tax returns. He essentially stole your identity to access your inheritance money. I felt a wave of anger wash over me. David's betrayal was even deeper than I had imagined. But here's the most interesting thing we found, Agent Chin said, pulling out a small notebook. Your husband kept detailed records of all his transactions. He documented every dollar he stole from you and every investment he made with your money. Why would he keep records of his own crimes? Criminals often keep records because they convince themselves that what they're doing is legitimate business, Agent Rodriguez explained. In David's case, he seemed to believe that he was managing your money as your husband and that he would eventually pay you back. Agent Chin opened the notebook and showed me pages filled with David's handwriting. According to these records, David took a total of $8.7 million from your accounts over 8 years. That's even more than my lawyer thought, I said weakly. Yes, but here's the good news. These records show exactly where every dollar went. Some of it was spent on the house renovations and luxury items, but a significant amount was invested in legitimate businesses. Legitimate businesses? Your husband wasn't just running a Ponzi scheme. He was also making some real investments with your money. Some of those investments have been quite successful. Agent Rodriguez pulled out a financial summary sheet. Based on David's records and our investigation, we've been able to trace approximately $4.2 million to recoverable assets. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You found $4.2 million? Well, we know where it is. Actually recovering it will take some time, but it's a much better outcome than we initially expected. What about the rest of the money? Approximately $2.1 million was lost in the Ponzi scheme payouts to earlier investors. Another $1.8 million was spent on the house, cars, and luxury items. The remaining $600,000 appears to have been spent on daily living expenses over the 8 years. Agent Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Peterson, we want you to know that you're going to be our priority in terms of asset recovery. Because this was your inheritance money that was stolen first, you'll have the first claim on any recovered assets. Over the next few hours, the FBI agents explained the complex process of asset recovery and the criminal charges that David would be facing. He was looking at potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. What about Amanda? I asked. Is she going to prison too? Ms. Richards has been charged as an accessory to fraud, Agent Rodriguez explained. She knew that David was married and she helped him hide assets. She's looking at 3 to 5 years. As I left the FBI office that evening, I felt emotionally drained, but also hopeful for the first time in weeks. David's criminal empire was crumbling, and there was a real possibility that I would recover a significant portion of my inheritance. The next morning, I got a call from Patricia with more good news. Michelle, the FBI's investigation has uncovered something amazing, she said excitedly. Do you remember that David told you he had lost $3 million to criminals? Yes, he said he had invested with people who weren't legitimate businessmen. Well, it turns out those criminals were actually a legitimate private equity firm. David had invested your money with them, but he had been lying about losing it. So the money isn't lost. Not only is it not lost, but the investments have grown significantly. The FBI contacted the firm, and they confirmed that David's account currently has a balance of $4.8 million. I sat down heavily in my hotel room chair. $4.8 million? Yes. And because David used fraudulent documents to make the investment, the firm is cooperating fully with the FBI to return the money to you. So, how much of my inheritance will I actually get back? Patricia paused for a moment, calculating. Based on what the FBI has found, plus the private equity investment, plus the value of the house and other assets, you're looking at recovering approximately $7.1 million. I started crying, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. So I'm not poor after all. Michelle, you're going to be one of the wealthiest women in Maplewood Heights, Patricia said with a laugh. That afternoon, I decided to visit David in jail. I wanted to look him in the eye and let him know that his plan to steal my life had failed. The county jail was a depressing, gray building downtown. I had to go through multiple security checkpoints before I was allowed to see David in the visitor's room. When David walked into the room wearing an orange jumpsuit, he looked like a completely different person from the confident man who had mocked me just a week earlier. He was pale, his hair was unkempt, and he had dark circles under his eyes. "Michelle," he said as he sat down across from me at the metal table. "I'm so glad you came." "I came to tell you that I know everything," I said calmly. "I know about the Ponzi scheme, the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, everything." David's shoulders slumped. "I never meant for it to get this complicated." "You never meant to get caught," I corrected him. "No, I mean I never meant to hurt you. I thought I could make the investments work and then tell you about the money when you got home." "David, you stole almost $9 million from me. You used my inheritance to commit crimes against dozens of innocent people. You can't pretend this was some kind of misunderstanding." "I know," David said quietly. "I know I messed up everything." "You called me poor," I said, my voice getting stronger. "You mocked my military service. You told me I was worthless and had nothing to offer." "I was scared," David said. "I knew you would find out about the money eventually, and I was trying to make you leave before that happened. So you thought if you were cruel enough to me, I would just disappear and you could keep my inheritance." David didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. "Well, I have some news for you, David. The FBI found most of my money. I'm going to get back over $7 million. David looked up at me with surprise and something that might have been relief. "And you know what else?" I continued. "I'm going to use some of that money to make sure you stay in prison for as long as possible. I'm hiring the best prosecutors money can buy to make sure you pay for what you did to me and to all those other people." "Michelle, please," David said desperately. "I'm still your husband. We can work this out." I stood up from the table. "No, David. Our divorce will be finalized next week. You'll be my ex-husband, and then you'll just be another criminal who tried to steal from the wrong person." As I walked toward the exit, David called after me. "Michelle, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I turned back to look at him one last time. "I spent 15 years being faithful to you while I served my country. I defended people like you, people who don't deserve the freedom that good soldiers die to protect. But now I know who you really are, and I'm not sorry about what's happening to you." The guard opened the door for me, and I walked out of the jail knowing that I would never see David as a free man again. 3 weeks later, I stood in the same courthouse where David had mocked me and called me poor. This time, I was there for his sentencing hearing. He had pled guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years in federal prison. Amanda had also pled guilty and received 3 years. She was crying as they led her away in handcuffs. But I felt no sympathy for her. She had helped David steal my father's legacy, and now she was paying the price. As for me, the FBI had recovered $7.3 million of my inheritance, even more than Patricia had initially estimated. I was indeed one of the wealthiest people in Maplewood Heights, just as she had predicted. But the money wasn't the most important thing I had gained from this experience. I had learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined, and that justice sometimes does prevail against people who think they can take advantage of others. David had called me poor and worthless, but now he was the one with nothing. He had lost his freedom, his girlfriend, his reputation, and any chance of a normal life. And I had gotten the ultimate revenge, not through cruelty or violence, but simply by ensuring that the truth came to light and that justice was served. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I knew that my real life was just beginning. I had my father's legacy back, I had my dignity restored, and I had learned never to underestimate the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what's right. David had thought he could mock me and steal from me because I was just a soldier returning home with nothing. But he had forgotten that soldiers are trained to fight for what they believe in, and I had spent 15 years learning how to never give up. Now he would have 15 years in prison to think about his mistakes, while I would spend those same years building the life that my father had always dreamed I would have. The revenge was complete, and justice had been served.